After a grueling day filled with handshakes, policy discussions, and the usual political marathon, J.D. Vance pulls into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a small but cherished eatery in Springfield, Ohio. The neon sign flickers above, its glow a warm invitation against the cool evening air. The scent of sizzling burgers and freshly brewed coffee escapes through the door every time someone steps in or out, painting a picture of simple, homegrown American comfort. This wasn't a high-end restaurant or political gala, just a no-frills, well-worn spot where locals gathered to unwind after long days of their own. He had been told the diner served the best homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries in town, and after a day that drained both mind and body, a quiet meal in a place like this seemed like the perfect way to end it. The moment J.D. steps inside, the bell above the door jingles, and for a fleeting second, the diner feels exactly as he expected, warm, familiar, unassuming. The walls are lined with faded Polaroids capturing decades of customers. The same handful of regulars occupy their usual booths, and the low hum of conversation hums like an old song. But then, something shifts. The hostess, a young woman behind the counter, starts to smile but hesitates. Her expression flickers, just for a second, but long enough for J.D. to notice. A few customers turn their heads his way, their conversations briefly interrupted. One man, mid-bite into his burger, leans in to whisper something to his companion. A woman in a flannel shirt sets her coffee cup down a little too hard. The air thickens, not with the aroma of fried bacon and strong coffee, but with something more intangible, discomfort. J.D. isn't naive. He's been in enough rooms where his presence wasn't entirely welcome. He knows the look, the whispered exchanges, the unspoken tension that can shift a space in an instant. But here, in a small-town diner, that's unexpected. Approaching the counter, J.D. lets out a small, polite chuckle, brushing off the unusual energy in the room. Dining in, if that's all right, he says, his voice even and unassuming. But the hesitation from the hostess deepens. She quickly glances toward the kitchen, her lips pressing into a thin line. I need to check something real quick. Just one moment. With that, she disappears through the swinging kitchen doors, leaving J.D. standing in the middle of the diner like a man whose presence itself had thrown off the rhythm of the place. More heads turn his way now. A man at the counter shifts in his seat. Someone mutters something under their breath. The second stretches, long and uncomfortable. J.D. doesn't move, doesn't react. He just waits. When the hostess returns, she isn't hesitant anymore. She's certain. Her voice is firm, her decision already made. I'm sorry, sir, she says, standing a little straighter now. We can't serve you tonight. No explanation. No excuses about a private event or a staffing issue. Just that, and the way she says it leaves no doubt. This isn't about business. It's personal. For a long moment, J.D. doesn't say anything. The weight of the words hangs between them, thick and unspoken, filling the space like steam rising from the kitchen. The diner is quiet now, not silent, but quiet enough that every small sound is amplified. A fork scrapes against a plate. The sizzle from the grill in the back crackles. A lonely noise in an otherwise stilled room. Eyes are on him, watching, waiting. He has options. He could shake his head, turn on his heel, and leave. He could call them out, demand an explanation, throw down the weight of his title as a U.S. Senator, and see if that changes anything. He could make this a headline by morning, let the media run wild with it. But J.D. does none of that. Instead, he exhales through his nose, settling his hands on his hips. His voice when he speaks is even, measured. I'm sorry, did I do something wrong? The hostess doesn't fidget this time. She doesn't even blink. We'd just rather not serve you tonight. No policy. No excuse about closing hours. Just a closed door with no handle. J.D. nods slowly, his mind working to the moment, cataloging the shift in energy, the way the air itself seems charged with something unspoken. Then, in a move that catches nearly everyone off guard, he simply asks, "Can I speak with the manager?" A ripple of reaction passes through the diner. Someone at the counter mutters under their breath. Another person lets out a soft, incredulous laugh, as if J.D. had just suggested something absurd. But he doesn't waver. He just stands there, waiting. After another long pause, The hostess disappears through a different door. More silence follows. More stolen glances and quiet anticipation. Then, the door swings open and out steps a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, a grease-stained apron wrapped around his waist. His name tag reads Don. Don doesn't ask J.D. what he wants. He doesn't greet him, doesn't feign hospitality. Instead, he sizes him up with one sweeping glance and then says flatly, "I hear you got a question." It's not an invitation. It's a challenge. J.D. meets Don's stare, steady and unreadable. He's not here to argue. He's not here to throw his weight around. But he's also not about to just walk away without understanding why. "Yeah," J.D. says, his voice even. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." For the first time, Don hesitates. Not much, just a flicker. He exhales sharply through his nose, wiping his hands on his apron. "This ain't personal," Don finally says. J.D. raises an eyebrow. Seems pretty personal. And in that moment, everyone in the diner knows. The real conversation is just beginning. The room seems to shrink, the space between J.D. and Don tightening like an invisible rope pulling at both ends. Every patron, every set of eyes, becomes part of the moment, silent spectators waiting to see how this plays out. Some look away when J.D. meets their gaze, as if they don't want to be caught watching. Others stare openly, their expressions ranging from quiet disapproval to barely contained amusement. An older man in a well-worn work jacket sits at the counter, his weather hands wrapped around a coffee mug. He shakes his head slowly, as if he's seen this kind of thing before. A few booths over, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leans back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, watching like this is the best entertainment he's had in a while. J.D. doesn't react. He's been in high-pressure debates, in rooms filled with people waiting for him to slip up. But this is different. This isn't about policy or public perception. This is something raw, more personal. Don shifts his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. "People around here got their opinions about you," he says, his voice careful. "About the things you stand for. I got a business to run, and I don't want trouble." J.D. tilts his head slightly. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don doesn't answer right away. Instead, he glances toward the counter, where the old man is still stirring his coffee, now much slower than before. Across the diner, the younger guy in the booth smirks like he's enjoying the exchange. J.D. exhales. He's seen this before, not in diners necessarily, but in people. This isn't just about a meal. It's about expectations, about silent pressures, about decisions made not because they feel right, but because they feel necessary. Most politicians, hell, most people, would take the rejection and walk out, maybe fire off an angry tweet or call a lawyer. Others might lash out, turn this into a spectacle, demand an explanation loud enough for the whole town to hear. J.D. does neither. Instead, he pulls out a chair, sits down, and calmly says, "Then let's talk." A crackle of surprise ripples through the room. Conversations that had been whispered stop completely. Even the kitchen, which had been clattering with the sounds of plates and orders being called out, falls silent. Don raises an eyebrow. "Talk." J.D. nods. "Yeah, you don't want me here. I get that. What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it." A short, disbelieving laugh escapes from the younger man in the booth. Man, this guy's got nerve. J.D. doesn't even look his way. He just keeps his gaze on Don, waiting. Don doesn't sit, not yet. He grips the back of a chair in front of him. His apron still dusted with flour, the kind that had probably been there since the morning shift. His jaw tightens. He looks toward the customers, like he's gauging whether they're still with him. "I run a business." Don finally says, "I don't pick fights. I don't want headlines. But I got a community to think about." J.D. nods. "All right. So, tell me, what does this community think about me?" Don hesitates. He looks over his shoulder, almost as if expecting someone else to answer. The waitress behind the counter shifts uncomfortably. The old man at the counter keeps his eyes down, but his fork hasn't moved in a while. Finally, Don sighs. "People here don't like politicians. Don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, they don't sit right with folks." J.D. leans back slightly. "Fair enough. But you don't know me, do you? Don exhales sharply. Not personally, no. JD gestures toward the room. Then tell me this. If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation? Silence. JD watches as Don's expression shifts. Just slightly. Not a full change, but a crack in the wall. A small one, but enough to let something else in. Before Don can respond, the younger man in the booth scoffs. This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are. JD turns toward him, his expression unreadable. And who am I? The guy grins, leaning forward like he's finally getting the fight he wanted. You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics like everyone else. JD nods slowly, considering the words. All right, he says evenly. Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently? The younger man blinks. That wasn't the response he expected. JD doesn't give him an out. You want me gone? Fine, but you've got the floor. Say what you need to say. The diner is dead silent now. Even the kitchen has gone still. No plates clinking, no orders being shouted. Just waiting, watching. Don sighs, rubbing the back of his neck. This ain't what I expected tonight. JD cracks a small, tired smile. Me neither. But for the first time, the tension isn't just about division. It's about something else, something closer to understanding. The younger guy in the booth straightens in his seat, looking uncertain now. He was expecting JD to argue, to defend himself, to fight back. Instead, JD just waits. Finally, Don sighs. You want to know what people think? He shakes his head. They think you're full of it. JD doesn't react, just tilts his head slightly, as if considering the words. They think you talk about working class folks, but you still play the game. Don continues. That you make promises like every other guy in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes. JD nods slowly. I get that. The younger man lets out a scoff. That's all you're going to say? JD turns toward him. What else do you want me to say? The guy opens his mouth, but nothing comes out. JD continues, his voice steady. You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad, wanted me to fight back so you could feel justified. He looks back at Don. But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like? Don studies him for a long moment. The tension in his shoulders seems to ease. Just a little. From the counter, the old man finally speaks up. Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. The crack in the wall widens. Someone near the window smirks. Even Don lets out a small chuckle, shaking his head. For the first time that night, the conversation doesn't feel like a fight. It feels like something else. Something real. The old man's quiet remark. Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. Settles over the room like a ripple in still water. It's not loud. It's not meant to be provocative. But it lands. For the first time since J.D. Vance walked through the door, the tension in the diner doesn't feel as sharp. People shift in their seats. Their body language no longer is rigid. A few even exchange glances, as if suddenly aware of how far things have gone. Even Don, the manager, seems to absorb the moment differently. He exhales, rubbing his hands together, staring at the table as if reconsidering the weight of the decision he's made. This isn't just about politics. It's about perception, about who gets to belong, about whether rejecting someone at the door really changes anything at all. J.D. watches him closely, but he doesn't push. He doesn't press his advantage. Instead, he lets the silence settle, lets Don think. From the back of the room, the younger man who had been so vocal leans forward. His smirk is gone. He's still skeptical, still guarded, but the edge of amusement has worn off. J.D. doesn't need everyone to agree with him. He doesn't need them to change their minds in one conversation. He just needs them to see him, not as a headline, not as a symbol of everything they distrust, but as a person sitting at a table waiting for an answer. And then, finally, Don sighs. He looks toward the kitchen, where the cooks have been quietly watching. He looks at the customers, many of whom are still holding their breath. Then, at last, he looks back at J.D. I'll tell you what, Don says. You sit here and finish this conversation. And if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu. JD raises an eyebrow, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sound like a deal. A quiet murmur spreads across the room. Nothing dramatic, just a shift in the air. The kind of shift that happens when an outcome isn't quite what people expected. The younger man in the booth scoffs but doesn't argue. The old man at the counter takes another sip of his coffee, as if satisfied with how this is playing out. Even the waitress, Mary, hesitates for only a second before finally reaching for a laminated menu and walking it over. She places it in front of J.D. without a word, her expression neutral but not hostile. He nods and thanks. Appreciate it. Don shakes his head, half in amusement, half in disbelief. I still don't know if I like you. J.D. chuckles, flipping open the menu. That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me. Don exhales through his nose, a half laugh, half sigh, then turns toward the kitchen. All right, boys, fire up the grill. And just like that, the wall that had been standing between them begins to crumble. The clatter of plates and silverware slowly returns, conversations bubbling back to life like a simmering pot no longer threatening to boil over. The diner starts to feel like a diner again. J.D. leans back in his seat, letting the moment settle. When the plate finally arrives, a classic cheeseburger, golden fries piled neatly on the side. He takes his time. He picks up the burger, takes a deliberate bite, chews, swallows. Then deadpan, he says, "A little dry." For a second, the entire diner is still. And then Don barks out a laugh. A real one this time. A few other customers chuckle. Even Mary, the waitress, shakes her head as she refills a coffee cup nearby. J.D. wipes his hands on a napkin, smirking. Kidding. It's good. Don just shakes his head, still grinning. You're a piece of work. J.D. nods. I've been told. The younger guy in the booth doesn't say anything, but he's no longer leaning back like this is a show. He's watching differently now, like someone who's not entirely convinced but isn't entirely dismissive either. That's enough. As J.D. finishes his meal, the conversations around him continue, but there's something different now, a subtle shift. People are still skeptical. They still have their opinions. But for one night, in one small town, something happened that doesn't happen nearly enough. A conversation, not a shouting match, not a viral moment filled with outrage, just a group of people, some who disagree, some who might never see eye to eye, talking, listening. It's not about changing minds in an instant. It's about proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a fight, that maybe, just maybe, there's still room for something in between. As J.D. sets his napkin down and takes the last sip of his coffee, he meets Don's gaze one final time. You ever had this happen before? Don asks, tilting his head slightly. J.D. thinks about it. Not just a rejection, because rejection is part of the job. But this, being turned away, not for something he said that day, not for an immediate mistake, but because of the weight of perception, of reputation, of how people think they know someone before ever meeting them. No, J.D. admits, not like this. Don nods slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. And you stayed. J.D. shrugs, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah. Don lets out a short chuckle. Most guys in your position would have walked out, made a fuss, maybe called a lawyer, maybe made sure this place was all over the news by morning. J.D. smirks. Thought about it. That earns another laugh. But then Don sobers. You're not going to change everyone's mind. J.D. nods. I know. Don runs a hand over his face, looking tired, not just from the long shift, but from something deeper. And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow morning. J.D. grins. That's fair. From the counter, the old man pipes up again, not looking up from his coffee. Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger. J.D. turns toward him, smirking. Well, I think that's about to change. A moment later, Mary sets the bill on the table and hesitates before speaking. We make the coffee strong here, she mutters. J.D. takes one last sip, and raises an eyebrow. I can tell. A few chuckles ripple through the diner. It's not much, but it's something. As JD stands, he takes one last look around. The younger guy in the booth still doesn't look convinced, but he's thinking now. Don still looks guarded, but he's not dismissive. The old man at the counter sips his coffee, nodding ever so slightly. It's not a victory, but it's not a loss either. And sometimes that's enough. As JD walks out, the bell above the door jingled behind him. The diner fades back into its usual rhythm. Plates clinking, coffee brewing, conversations unfolding. But something lingers. A moment where, for once, staying and listening meant more than walking away.